Guys, welcome back to Muscle Minds with Scott Stevenson. I'm Scott McNally, and all of our programming, it's brought to you by BYOBBcoach.com. You can get Scott's book there. If you want to get the hardcover, we've got a link below. You can get the hardcover there, and it's special edition because Scott's going to sign it for you. It's through eBay. So check that out. It's really the best deal you can get. Plus, you're going to also donate money to the ASPCA to help with animals. So I think that's freaking cool. Supplementsource.ca for Canadians. They have great deals that change week to week. And TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK over there. High quality protein powders. Every freaking basic supplement you could think of under the sun that you need, like intra-workout, creatine, all of that. Great flavors. Check them out. And of course, Patreon. We've got a couple Patreon questions today. Scott, I was about to sneeze through that whole intro, but I made it through.
Nice job.
I'm good. What do we want to start with? I think we were talking a little bit about this question related to stretching, huh?
Yeah, we can go into that. It was a good question that was on the Facebook group that I gave a long answer to. Okay.
What's the deal here? I just see, to clarify, occlusion and extreme stretching as part of Fortitude training. Oh, so is this what you wrote back to them?
That was part of the question. There was a bigger question was, when should I do stretches? So her name on Instagram or on Facebook is So Many Toes.
Okay.
and then Amy, I think maybe is her last name. People can look up the profile and look up the question if they're in the group. But the question was like, when do I do the stretches? And so it's kind of important as to when you incorporate those to some degree because of how they work. So and people who've done DC training or Fortitude training know that Dante recommended, not everyone did this necessarily, and it's not going to be the end of the world if you don't, but that you would do them with the muscle that you've just trained and just pumped up. Within a few minutes, likely. You can do it. You don't have to do it necessarily right. Remember when I first did DC training, before I knew Dante and I just read about it somewhere, and I was doing the stretches like as an add-on at the end of the rest pause sets. And I would actually do them. I'd finish the pulses or the partials, and I go right into the stretch. Because someone said go right into the stretch. So I just kept the weight there. So that was just brutal. So you do, the 3 segments of the rest pause, and then you do try to pulse the weight out for up to 30 seconds. And then once I couldn't move the weight, I would just hold it. And it was just fucking, I remember I did it on leg presses, for instance, a rest pause. You're not supposed to do really rest pauses on leg presses, but I remember doing it, before I figured that out. And you just hold the weight down at the bottom. So I'm being crushed and trying to, I had to set it up so I didn't actually get caught under there and pinned. Yeah. But just absolute brutal. So anyway, the thing her question was about whether an occlusion stretch would create more blood flow, which might help with sarcomerogenesis. So there's some pieces there I think that are worth kind of looking into because, for one reason, is when I've done Fortitude training camps, and oftentimes the majority of the people there have done Fortitude training already, and that's how they knew about me, whatever, and they want to come to a camp so they can get better at it. And many of them have just not been doing the stretches. I would say the majority, more than 50%, just don't do the stretches. And the stretches are brutal. And I think they constitute a novel stimulus that can indeed potentially create muscle growth for individuals, at least under certain circumstances that you wouldn't otherwise have. So she had a question about the quad stretch, for instance. One thing I noticed, and people are going to say, "Oh, that's bullshit. Where do you come up with this?" But I've mentioned this, I think, on this podcast. One thing I noticed when I started doing those quad stretches, when I was training with Dave Henry, is that I got better, quote unquote, separation in my quads. So this is sort of an example of a stretch and a type of stimulus you can't really create probably safely in any other way. So you train your quads. Your rectus femoris is the middle muscle of your quads, right? It runs down the front. It's a bipennate muscle, so if it's really well developed and you're lean enough, you can actually see there's a central tendon. Then there's striations, so to speak. It's pretty badass when you get that. If you have that and you see it, it's really fucking cool. High green is someone who has that. It's got striations all over the place. Yeah. And if that is well developed, then you've got the medialis on the inside, the lateralis on the outside, and then you have this muscle in between. And the larger that is, the rounder that is, the bigger the separation, literally, and the delineation between the medialis on the inside and the lateralis on the outside. Imagine the rectus femoris was just flat and sort of just, there wasn't much there. Somehow it was like underdeveloped, it'd been partially denervated or something. You wouldn't see that delineation, separation between the two muscles, because you wouldn't have like a round medialis, a round rectus femoris, and a round lateralis. So one of the things about the rectus femoris in particular, like the hamstrings too generally, is that it's biarticulate. So when you do a squat, the rectus femoris is a hip flexor. So if you're standing there and you lift your knee up, your psoas, your iliacus, those are the major hip flexors, but your rectus femoris is also a hip flexor. So it shortens when you flex at the hip. But it's also a knee extensor, like all of the quads, right? So when you go down on a squat, right, you're bending at the knee, you're flexing at the knee, and you would be lengthening your rectus femoris, right? But you're flexing at the hip, which would be shortening your rectus femoris. So like many biarticulate muscles, the hamstrings, the gastroc, there's this biomechanical transference of angular torque or angular momentum that is created by having these muscles that cross two joints. Because if you look at it, and this is, I've talked before, this is Lombard's paradox. Like, so what happens to the rectus femoris when you squat down? It lengthens at the knee, but it shortens at the hip. So does it lengthen or does it shorten, right? All in all, its length doesn't change very much. So you'll activate it in doing a quad exercise, doing a squat, compound exercise like that. But it never really gets activated when it's in a lengthened position, right? To that great of extent during that movement, because it's shortening at one end and lengthening at the other. So overall, the muscle length is the same. But what if then you take it and do a quad stretch? So the way I have people do this, you find something, a pad behind you, like the round pads on a lat pull-down machine that you put your knees under to hold yourself down. Those are great for this. So you can put the top part of your foot on one of those, so your legs back behind you, your knees flex, you're doing a quad stretch, and you just rest the top part of your foot on that, and you can go squat down and thrust your hips forward and stretch your quad and get some hip extension, and you can really then your rectus femoris is on stretch, right? At both joints as much as you can, and then you activate it. So that's what an occlusion stretch is in Fortitude training, is you get into a stretch position and then you voluntarily perform an isometric contraction in that stretch position. And as long as you're in a good biomechanical position, and the nice thing is you can do these unilaterally, you can activate with all of your might. You can do a maximal voluntary isometric contraction in a stretch position, and you would hold that for 60 to 90 seconds typically, unless you just need to do less. So you take the rectus femoris in many of these situations where it's not like on a squatting movement, for instance. On knee extension, it's different. You got lengthening and shortening, right? Just like the other quads. But in the let's say you just do squats, you wouldn't get that lengthened position. You can take the rectus femoris, which wouldn't always be lengthening and shortening during normal concentric, eccentric exercises, and put it in a lengthened position, and then activate the bejesus out of it as maximal effort for a minute straight. You don't do with free weights. You don't do any maximal activation until you really get to the end of your set, because the first reps aren't maximal. You can do that on an isokinetic device in the lab, for instance, but in some machines that used to be out. But typically gyms, you don't have that equipment in a gym. So you take someone who's never done that, and it's particularly the rectus femoris, put it in a stretch position, activate it maximally like that, and add that regularly. Now you've got the possibility, potentially, because you're at a lengthened position, like there's really, unless you're doing sissy squats, right, where you're in that lean back, extended position, you got a weight on your chest maybe, and you're going deep into a squatting position, then you're going to have some activation of the rectus femoris in that lengthened position, but only at the bottom of the movement, and then it's going to be shortened as you come back up. So this is a very novel tension in the lengthened position stimulus, especially for the rectus femoris. And what I noticed before I thought all this through and sort of figured all this out as to how this could happen in my head is that it looks like I'm getting better separation in my quad. It's not like my quad's just getting, although DC training is phenomenal for putting on muscle size, my quads were looking different, and Dave noticed the same thing. Better separation, and that's between the rectus femoris and the medialis and lateralis on either side.
Okay.
So that's something like you putting a muscle. This is what extreme stretchers out. You could put a muscle in a lengthened position and activate it, and and this is what lengthened partials are about. And the studies are very, very mixed now. The more studies they do, the more they suggest that this isn't going to just happen universally all the time. And we can talk more about that. But if there is some room for creating sarcomerogenesis, and I'll explain what that is. So it's generating more sarcomeres. So what happens when you put muscles in lengthened positions or chronically lengthen them, or you put cast muscles in shortened positions, is the muscle will adapt its resting length to accommodate the length that it normally sees. And that's so that the actin and myosin overlap is somewhat optimized for maximal interaction of actin and myosin during the range of motion where the muscle is actually producing tension. Makes sense. So if the muscle's always short, it does want to have actin and myosin that can't interact with one another because the sarcomeres are so teensy. So you lose sarcomeres. Less sarcomeres means for a given muscle length, each sarcomere is longer, and you now optimize the actin and myosin overlap in the sarcomere.
And what's a sarcomere?
Oh, sorry. So if you look, here's how I'm glad you asked that. I love talking about this shit. I don't get to teach this stuff anymore. So the way I sort of imagine you've got a muscle cell, and it's kind of like a spaghetti can that's full of like uncooked spaghetti, right? So that's your muscle cell is the can, and it's long, sort of cylindrical. And if you reach in and pulled out one strand of spaghetti, that would be a myofibril, right? And if you picked it up and looked at it, and it runs from end to end from the muscle cell, and looked at it, you'd see there's these little singular segments. It's got little sections, and that's actually where you see technically in the scientific realm what striations are. And you'll see there's this pattern, this striped pattern as you look down each of these myofibrils. You see that on all of the spaghetti strands. And that is, each of those sections is composed of what's called a Z line, which is the border between each of these sarcomeres. So each section is a sarcomere. And you've got myosin coming from the sides, from the Z lines, and it comes from a German word Zwischenlinie, the lines between the sarcomeres. Zwischen means between. And you've got, actin there, actin arms, and in the middle you got a big piece of myosin. So when there's ATP available, you got calcium available. Sequence events happen where the actin or the myosin binds to the actin, and you have what a power stroke happens. And each time that happens, you would shorten, as long as the muscle can actually shorten. It pulls the actin towards the middle of the sarcomere. So you do that with all the sarcomeres along all the spaghetti strands in that particular fiber. This is just one fiber. And as long as the force is, the external applied force isn't too high, the muscle can actually shorten, the fiber can shorten. The myosin pulls the actin towards the middle, and each of those sarcomeres get shorter, each of the myofibrils gets shorter, and the whole fiber gets shorter. And that's a concentric contraction. Okay. So you can change the length of the fiber by losing or gaining sarcomeres. Okay. So if you have then a muscle that is being exposed to tension in a lengthened position, or just is chronically lengthened, you see that's kind of the classic conditions. But this is what we're seeing. You can look at so the muscle fibers are organized in fascicles, bundles of fibers called fascicles. So you at an ultrasound, for instance, you can see that, and you can look at the angle of those fascicles and get an idea of how long the fascicles are, how long the fibers are. And some studies have suggested that the fibers actually change length when you expose them to high tensions in a lengthened position. It makes sense. So back to, we've got the sarcomere here, the Z lines, the actin and myosin, and if you've got that always being lengthened, so that the actin, there's some myosin that doesn't have any actin to interact with. So the sarcomeres are too long to have good actin and myosin overlap. The more myosin that interacts with the actin, the more tension you produce. Each of those myosin-actin interaction produces a small amount of tension. The more that you have. When it's optimal, you get the maximal tensions. When it's too long, you get less tension. When it's too short, you've got overlap such that you've got actin doesn't have any myosin to interact with. So there's a length-tension relationship. So if you're chronically producing force in the lengthened position, or you've got this stimulus from training, a smart way to adapt to that is to add more sarcomeres so that when you're in that lengthened position, each sarcomere doesn't have to be as long anymore. And now you've got a more optimal actin and myosin overlap. Yeah, so that is sarcomerogenesis, the genesis of more sarcomeres because of having trained in a lengthened position. So if there's any, and see the thing is like that can happen, but you still have an origin and an insertion for your muscle, right? It's like you can't just all of a sudden, like you can't like create sarcomerogenesis so your quads are just like hanging off your leg with this like extra loop of muscle that's available there. You'll only get that to some certain degree, right? Because you've got a skeleton that your muscles are attached to. So once you've exploited sarcomerogenesis to some degree by forcing the muscle to be used or be in a lengthened position, then that's all you got. Like you're not going to get any more of that. But what that means is if you've added sarcomeres, you've added contractile tissue to the fibers.
So the fiber is the same length. The spaghetti piece is the same piece. You're just adding more segments.
You've still got the same origin insertion, right? You didn't change that.
Yeah.
But now each of your fibers has more sarcomeres, or at least the majority of them, you presume, let's just say that all of them, has more sarcomeres, so that when the muscle and when the fibers are stretched out, those sarcomeres aren't so stretched out that they don't have good actin and myosin overlap.
Okay.
But when you do a measurement of how big is the muscle, you take it back to anatomical position, some standardized position, and now you've got the muscle it's better able to accommodate force production in lengthened position because there's literally more actin and myosin and there's more sarcomeres in there. And when you bring it back to that standardized position where you measured pre-training, now you've got simply more muscle mass. So you've got it's like a hot dog, let's say, or think of the muscle as a hot dog that is accommodated more, being able to produce force in that lengthened position, and so there's more actin and myosin, there's more meat to it, and when you squish it back down, this is a very pliable hot dog here. You squish it back down, now it's got a greater diameter. Yeah. It's got a greater thickness if you measure it that way, or it's got a greater cross-sectional area. So you literally have more muscle mass, and it would be rounder, right? It would literally be rounder. Because you have the same distance between the actin and myosin, right? And we're talking about a fusiform muscle here that has kind of like that hot dog-like shape, right? It starts narrow and then it expands to some middle point where it's the roundest and has the greatest diameter. But it's got more, so it's just going to get more round. It's going to be have more sphericity, literally, if you were to measure that. So training in that lengthened position, if that still can be exploited. Now, if someone's been training for years and they're doing full range of motion stuff, and they've already exploited whatever increment in the number of sarcomeres they could get because their muscles have adapted to training in that lengthened position, well, then they've already used that up. This is the way I see it. Like, there's no more, you can't, like I said, it's not going to just keep going until you've got this muscle that is like, because you can only train at certain lengths, right? And unless you're dislocating your joints or something crazy like that. So there's only so much you can do. But for someone who, for instance, has always done short and range of motion stuff, for instance, maybe it's gotten to that point, maybe because they had joint issues, and then starts training in the lengthened position, this would be a possibility. And for someone too, like this is just sort of a potential application. If someone can't really train in the lengthened position because of some sort of structural issues, injuries they've had, you can go and create two of the major things that are important for the sarcomerogenesis, if they've lost some sarcomeres because of limited range of motion, because the muscles never be exposed to producing tension in length position, if they can safely get into a lengthened position and do stretches where they contract simultaneously, this is what I call an occlusion stretch, you have two of the components that are necessary potentially for sarcomerogenesis if sarcomeres had been lost over time. So they could literally regain muscle mass to a certain degree. It's not going to be tremendous. I don't imagine this is like, going to boost your gains, you're going to, gain 50% more muscle or something like that.
Yeah.
But it can be, somewhat substantial. So it's one of those things where you simply can't, unless you're just doing, like this is, in a way, there's one thing I need to add too. So when someone does lengthened partials, so let's say they're doing lengthened partials in a really lengthened position.
What's a lengthened partial?
Okay, so it's a partial range of motion repetition. This is a huge thing. It's not so. It's still talked about. There's tons and tons of people talking about lengthened partials, and there's a couple of people who are like really big on this is the best way to grow muscle. And there were people who were doing all their training in the lengthened position. So it's basically doing a partial repetition when the muscle's in a lengthened position. So you would do pec flies, and you'd only start way stretched out and only go halfway up and come back down.
Okay.
Right,
okay.
On a pec deck or whatever, whether it's a dumbbell, everything would be in the lengthened position. So they're because stretch activated calcium channels, for instance, are involved with muscle damage, muscle soreness. There's some potential. It seems like too, in studies that have looked at this directly, that training in the lengthened position can be more damaging. So it may in and of itself be an intrinsically more stressful type of contraction to train in the lengthened position. And that could be biomechanically. It could be just because of the muscle length. There's a number of factors that could be. There could be activation related to whether you can actually do that, whether your activation becomes a little bit wonky. How fine-tuned an activation is one thing that could contribute to whether you have more or less muscle soreness. You see this when you go and do a variation of an exercise you've been doing, but you're a little bit uncomfortable and you just get really sore. You do the same number of sets, same effort, everything else, and all of a sudden like you're just sore as crap, and all you did was just change the type of deadlift you did, but it just hits you very differently. So there's something about potentially a component of doing coupled concentric, eccentric contractions in that lengthened position, which would make it different than just doing a lengthened isometric contraction, like an occlusion stretch in Fortitude training, or an extreme stretch, which is in DC training and in Fortitude training. But if it's going to be something, if for someone who does want to do a bunch of lengthened partials, like lengthened partials are an option for a pump set in Fortitude training. That's why I left pump sets open that way. You could do a bunch of lengthened partials and have that component at least the days you do those. But for someone who has, like for the rectus femoris, it's a great way to, you can literally produce a maximal contraction, and isometrics will produce muscle growth in the lengthened position, which you would never really be able to do under most normal circumstances, or people never would have done. It's a very simple way to add that potentially additional stimulus. And I think too, this is very somewhat, but it's something you would need to be auto-regulated. This is why I have 3 different stretches in Fortitude training, because if your normal training is a stimulus enough, and you add this is an extra stimulus. On the other hand, let's say you're short for time, and you've got 30 minutes or whatever to train your thighs. You're going to do a couple quad exercises, a couple thigh exercises, a couple hamstring exercises, 3 exercises, let's say. But you want to have more stimulus on that day because the way you've set up your split, etc. You can finish your last set that's quad intensive, and catch your breath. Go into that quad stretch. Pick maybe the weaker quad that you want to hit with a little more, and literally do 60 or 90 seconds. It's just that long. You just walk over to the place where you're not in anyone's way. You do the stretch. You hit it as hard as you can for 60 seconds, and you're done. And that's a powerful stimulus, and it took a minute. You didn't have to find a machine and load the weights and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very efficient way to produce a novel stretch and add to the variety in your training, because you just don't get that stretch in a lengthened position or tension in a lengthened position in any other normal exercise that you do, because it would be dangerous to try to do that in many cases, right? Potentially, at least. So you can do this with a pec. You take like one of my favorite ways to do this with just get like a chest high or maybe a little bit below cable, right? And grab the cable and then take the cable and have the cable behind your arm, right?
Okay.
On your head like that. And you lean forward and you're stretching the long head and you're stretching the other heads, the tricep, and you get a crazy tricep stretch, right? So you're in this like totally stretched out position. You could just do that with a dumbbell. It's another way to do it. Just go over, pick up a dumbbell, hold the dumbbell. And then what I'll often do is I kick my head back and link. So I got a 30-pound dumbbell in my hand, right? And you spend a minute in that position, and I'm pushing up against my own neck with the weight of the dumbbell to help with the load. And that's a crazy stimulus.
Oh, yeah.
And you get
people don't realize if they haven't done it how long a minute is.
Oh, it takes forever. Yeah, it feels like 10. Yeah. And you get and part of that too, like back to one of the questions that was asked about is, or one of the things she was wondering about is increased blood flow. And when you do these stretches, especially if it's an extreme stretch or an occlusion stretch, once you're above somewhere around 50% of a maximal effort, maximal voluntary contraction, you don't have blood flow. The tension within the muscle is too high for blood flow to get in there.
Okay, interesting.
Right? You're creating a pretty powerful occlusion. You might have some, but it's minimal, right? And the thing that's nice about that in a certain way is that you see this with blood flow occlusion training, blood flow restriction training, or KATSU training, is that you can, for a given load, if you restrict blood flow, you create more metabolic stress, right? You create thus more fatigue, and then your nervous system recognizes that and brings more motor units into play. So for a given light load, you're activating more muscle. This is one of the reasons why, at least in some studies, blood flow restriction training with a given load was better than normal training, because you have to activate more muscle because of the fatigue brought on by the blood flow restriction. So when you do an occlusion stretch, for instance, or an extreme stretch, I mean, be careful. Like some people would go with the extreme stretches. You can progressively overload those, and they're just doing crazy, silly stuff, and people have hurt themselves over the years. Dante's, gotten accusations from people like, "You hurt me." It's like, no, you were just being an idiot. Like, you don't need to go that high. But once you get into that occluded position, or into that stretch, and you're producing tension with either load or just voluntary contraction, you're gonna, with a given amount of neural drive or a given load, you're gonna get more motor units activated because of the occlusion. So you don't have to use like crazy ass weight to activate a lot of motor units. And
which could be
is important.
I'm thinking it could be a good idea for me where I'm at with my training. I can train. I'll call it more like exercise than training if I push my central nervous system too far,
right?
And then it ends up crashing me. But something like this would allow me to hit the muscle harder without having to do the crazy sets that I would have thought were ideal for me, or that were my jam in the past.
Right. So exactly, and that's why I put it in as an additional stress in Fortitude training. So there'll be some days where you can kind of auto-regulate within your sessions. So I've got 3 stretch types. This is why I did this. And I've noticed this from doing DC training. So this is one thing I wanted to kind of give some options for. Sometimes you do, and you just go to town, right? Say you train chest. Go to town. My chest tends to get really sore. It's like, now I got to do like shooting for 90 seconds, pec deck stretch with the whole stack and a plate on there, something like that, right? We just go crazy, right? You're in this stretch. It's very, very painful. That can have an effect on your nervous system too. You feel pretty wiped out after doing these, right? And there were some days it's like, okay, this is in the program, but I'm happy with the training. I progressed on my loads in the gym. I got a couple more reps with the weight, whatever. And then this is more than I need on this day. Some days it's like, give me more, baby. I'm gobble that shit up. Give me the fucking iron. I'm going to rip this shit apart. Other days it's like, okay, well, I can do this. I can do it. But the muscles feel early. You're getting soreness like during the workout. You feel when you get in the stretch, it's like, this is too much.
Yeah.
So that's why I put in an occlusion stretch. So an occlusion stretch, you activate as much as you feel fit, as much as fits your recovery state. You get into the stretch, and you're just bracing. Let's for a pec stretch, you just brace yourself against the wall, or grab a hold of the rack, something like that, and then you activate as much as makes sense. So it's very much an auto-regulatory thing. And then some days, I think it just makes sense to include some, I called it a flexibility stretch. You basically just take the muscle. You're not trying to create any tension there other than what happens passively from stretching the muscle. And you just get into that lengthened position to expose it to being in the lengthened position. You do, 20, 30, 40-second stretch and just sort of loosen things up. Because on those days, if you kind of know, it's like, okay, I'm going to come back. Fortitude training is high frequency. I'm going to come back and train this muscle in 2 days. I got it today. Mission is accomplished, right? So it was a way to add to those days when you feel like you got it in you, and you do an extreme stretch to try to progress on, or like some of the occlusion stretches can be harder because you get yourself in a position where it's maximal from the get-go. You can push as hard as you want. Whereas if you pick a weight, it doesn't get hard until 40 seconds in, right? So just like with the set, their first reps aren't effective. The first part of an extreme stretch wouldn't necessarily be effective, but you can make all of an occlusion stretch effective. Or you can make it all, it's just some more of a moderate stimulus by how hard you contract. And it's almost built-in auto-regulatory. If you're just wiped out, your all out isn't going to be that much because your nervous system's already whacked. So that could be a smart option where you're not really sure what to do. It's like, okay, I'm going to do an occlusion stretch and push as hard as I feel like I can. So anyway, but you don't get blood flow during the stretches. So blood flow wouldn't contribute to sarcomerogenesis. And I really think this is why we're seeing in some of these studies that you don't get more growth, is because people there's already been some sarcomerogenesis due to producing tension and lengthened possession just with normal full range of motion training. But like I noticed it with the rectus femoris. If someone has a muscle group that they don't feel like they have a good mind-muscle connection with, this is a way to train that, right? So you're going to pick an isolation stretch, which could be very akin to an exercise, so like a pec deck for the pecs. And if you're someone who is like a delt pusher, like you've said you were and didn't have trouble, like now you're getting to spend a minute in dire agony contracting and practicing a mind-muscle connection with your pecs.
Oh, so
and
true.
I think that carries over and allows you to make sure that, you're not using your delts, you're not using your triceps, it's just your pec, especially with the occlusion stretch, I'm big on intuitive stretching. So if you need to hit the lower part of your pec because the upper part has been destroyed, or you need to find a particular angle with internal external rotation at your shoulder, or the amount of abduction that you have, or whatever, the right angle, you can find that perfect angle that feels good. Maybe your shoulder's a little screwed up or what have you.
Yeah.
So it allows you to really tailor what you're doing, and you can literally today I did like flat pressing and decline pressing. I want to add something in the upper pec. So then you would do a stretch that hits the upper pec, and you would target and contract the upper pec to round out the total stimulus that you got in that singular workout by doing a different pec stretch, basically, in an occlusion stretch fashion. So, all right, I could ramble forever on this topic.
I like it, and you're actually getting me thinking about something. I'm gonna add this into my own training. I think it would, for me, where I'm at right now, it would make a lot of sense, and I think I would be able to actually get more activation out of the muscle this way, or I'll just say more out of the target muscle group that I'm trying to work, right now, without having to excessively push up. I don't have to increase the volume. I don't have to increase the intensity of my workouts. I can add. It's easy to add in. Sure, it's not always fun, but it's not a big time commitment either.
Yeah. It makes sense for lots of reasons.
Guys, let's talk about intra-workout carbs and saving money. So like the past 10, 15 years, intra-workouts become super popular. It's a great way to support pre-workout insulin use. It's great for recovery, and it's great for endurance in those long workouts. Here's the thing. It's really expensive. It's not only expensive for us, it's expensive for supplement companies. They really don't make a lot of money off of it. That's where True Nutrition comes in. So True Nutrition, they're not only a retailer, they're also a manufacturer. They're actually making a lot of the products that you guys are already buying from other companies. So Just think about it. You're going to cut out the middleman. The only thing you're going to miss out on is the fancy labels and the branding. Outside of that, you're getting the exact same high quality products, but you're getting it directly from the source. If you're going to pay for the price of highly branched cyclic dextrin, ensure that you're getting 25 grams per scoop, not of a mix of carbs, but just of highly branched cyclic dextrin. We can mix the other stuff in later, Use our code THINK, get some savings. Plus, it's like voting for us. It lets them know that you support what we're doing.
So, hey, what about this one, Scott? So I believe he's referring to one of the podcasts we did with Kuba. Guy named Steven. He's from Patreon, by the way. Thank you guys, everybody who's supporting the show on Patreon. He said, I saw an interview, possibly on this channel, and it was. Could you talk about adjusting training as you go on and off cycle and move between bulk and cut? The general idea was that if you're higher volume, that you did higher volume, lower weight during one phase, it may be beneficial to go lower volume, higher weight for the next, or vice versa. What are your thoughts on that?
So that's like, you could do like 3 hours of lecture on this idea, really.
Oh yeah,
because there's three topics there basically: on versus off cycle, off season versus pre-contest, and then changing your program to create a novel stimulus.
Oh, I didn't even think of the third. Yeah,
I mean that's basically what he was getting at, So where do we start? So on versus off cycle. Obviously, if you've been on and you've made gains and now you come off, you no longer have that support for your recovery. You no longer have that anabolic drive. Your goal there, to some degree, is going to be to hold on to what you had as much as you possibly can, and you're going to have to. This is the way I see it, at least. You're going to have to accommodate a diminished recovery ability. Right, but let's say someone got to where they're squatting 500 pounds for 10 reps, and they did that over the course of several years. And by using cycles, maybe progressively increasing the cycles, this is where they end up. That's their strength level, right? And then they come off and they go to HRT, just minimal true clinical HRT. They're not going to hold that strength, for 3 more years, right? That kind of clearly makes it like they're going to have to do something. You want to hold it as best they can, right? But you're losing that anabolism. So how you adjust your training is also going to be a temporal issue as well, because if you're just trying to hold for 3 months, that's not a big deal. You see guys, I've seen people say this like, haven't done a cycle now. I'm in my, I'm retired, whatever. And it's like, yeah, you just competed 2 months ago, right? It's like you've still got these residual gains that are there, so you could get away with that. So it depends on how much you adjust your training. Depends on how long you plan to be off, and how soon you're going to compete, which is going to allow you to adjust what you're going to do with your diet. So someone who had some fat that they could have added comfortably when they came off might try to substitute, or at least provide somewhat of a surrogate for the anabolism from the gear by eating more and even letting themselves get a little more fluffy than they would, so they can fight tooth and nail and make sure their nutrition in particular is dead on to allow them to recover and have an anabolic drive from the food. Make food your anabolic, so to speak. This is something that Dante has talked about many, many times over. I love to give him credit for this, because this is how he had people actually do. A lot of people when he's talked about, at least people that follow his sort of ideas, is that in your off season your food is your anabolic, and then you would add stuff in your pre-contest, then you can actually recomp as you go into your show. But so someone who is in a good position body fat wise and can then afford to maybe gain some body fat given when their next show is coming up. Not trying to do a show in 5 months, maybe in a year. They can add food to replace the gear and probably be able to hold on to their strength levels really well. And I think as long as you can keep their best performances in place, this is sort of the contention I've had for a while, is that there's some association between how you look, form, and function. So as long as the function, you can maintain the function, you're going to maintain the form. So if you can still do the 500 for, let's say, 8 reps 5 months later, you've probably kept a good deal of that muscle. You may need to basically add food in a way that allows you to actually gain some body fat in order to keep that in place. Under circumstances where you didn't have the gear coming in and out, adding that food and having that caloric excess might have produced gains. But now what you're doing is forestalling and preventing the loss of gains that would have come from coming off the gear. So that's one way to go about it. Generally speaking, you're going to have to accommodate the lack of ability to recover and have to be smart about your auto-regulation. But I think, and this segues us into the pre-contest idea, is that if you can, again, a Danteism, if you can dance with the one who brung you and keep those loads as high, keep the performance high, however it is that you train, and just use that as a metric for whether your form or your function is staying in place. I can still do the stuff I did in my off season or when I was on during my pre-contest or when I'm off. Then you're going to be able to maintain that muscle because it had that ability before and it still has that ability, but you simply can't train with as much volume. And your goal then is to maintain, not necessarily to gain so much. Although that can be had potentially over a long haul, but all in all, when you go from full bore, a gram and a half of stuff down to TRT, most people are going to lose something quite a bit, unless they've just started with training and they've still got a lot of gains to be had. So the same principle applies, I think, in both those situations. Is coming off gear, if you can eat more food, that will help. When you diet in, now you'll no longer have the food available because you're in a caloric deficit, right? So you lost the anabolism. In both cases, you're losing anabolism from gear in the first case and from food in the second case. And your training needs to be adjusted based on how you recover, and that's going to be highly individual, I think, depending on what their training was before. So then the next question, this actually kind of fits in pretty well, vacillating between a higher volume approach and a heavier load, maybe lower volume approach. And I've always sort of thought a good approach that many people have success with, if they like training this way, and if they find that they can make gains with all these ways of training, is DC training, Fortitude training, of course, because I like Fortitude training. If you don't like it, then don't do it for sure. And then one of John's programs, Mountain Dog training of some sort. And he's got a whole subset of approaches in there. So pick the programs that you like. Yeah. And so one thing that could be had in that context, for instance, is one way someone could do this is maybe they made their gains during their off season or while they're on doing Mountain Dog training, which tends to be higher volume, and they did that. And then if they know that Fortitude, there's a couple ways you can do this. If they know that Fortitude training works for them and they got experience with it and they know how to auto-regulate it, they could switch to that. And because built into Fortitude training are the different volume tiers, and they would then accommodate their volume tier based on their recovery ability and auto-regulate it as the effects of the gear wear off over time. If someone doesn't have experience with other programs, I would not just jump ship. I would dance with the one that brung you, and if Mountain Dog training was the one who brung you, John oftentimes in his programs has like 3 core training days or 4 core, and then some accessory days that you could add. And you might just take John's program. I'm sure John wouldn't roll over, thinking, oh my God, he's bastardized my program. And you just drop off some of the exercises and stick with the core program that brung you there, and just do 2 sets instead of 3 sets, or leave a set off, or leave an exercise off, or what have you, and stick with that. There's a guy, liebe Grüße an den Dennis, an dieser Stelle, wenn zuhört, a guy who I'm communicating with, a German guy who, I'm not sure exactly where he stands with this, but he's been doing Fortitude training for quite a while. He had a little injury issue, but he plans to diet down again. He's made good gains with that. He's very happy with that. And he knows, because he's been training for decades, he knows that he does really well with volume training, actually, not taking everything to failure. He knows how to auto-regulate his volume training when he diets down. And he's like, I'm going to do volume training when I diet down because I know it works. He's done it, 30 times or something, right? So he knows that system. If he didn't have that in place, Fortitude training has the possibility of just going down a volume tier because it worked for him, and he would dance with the one who brung him most recently in this last off season. But he knows volume training. He knows his body. He's been doing this. So he's not going to jump ship. He's just going to go to another program that he knows works for him. So there's 2 ways you can do that. You just transition and drop your volume in the same program as you go from on to off or off season to pre-contest, or you switch to another program that you know works for that change. So he might, I don't know what he would do on versus off. I'm sure he trains differently, but someone who has that experience obviously use what they know already works. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's another worthy saying here. So I think that covers all three domains of that question.
I like that. That's interesting. Yeah. And Kuba did bring some, he explained, basically he applied it to himself. He talked about his own training, and he talked about, one of the first things he did, and I'm just trying to think back to myself, he in the off season when food was extremely high, supplementation was there, he was completely able to, support going hard. It's when he would do the most intensifiers, things like rest pause and whatever else, and then as he went into a health phase, he'd pare everything back, basically pare it back so that he could stay strong.
Yep.
And then from there, work at maintaining that strength into the contest, which makes a lot of sense to me.
Same thing. Yeah. That's another way. Volume is one way to drop down the stimulus. Taking out the intensifiers is one way to do it. There's numerous things you can do. But I think, so often now people are looking for the easiest way, right? And this whole idea of dancing with the one who brung you.
It's not the easiest.
Yeah, it's not the easiest way. So like an old school way, and I used to get tons of questions on this, is people would, they're in their off season when they're feeling strong, they're doing lots of barbell compound exercises, the things that are hard, the things that got them the muscle mass to some degree. And then they want to switch to like all cable and unilateral stuff and pumping things, and they say like, I'll just do that. And I think to some degree that perspective or that approach probably has a historical roots in that if you were not like old school bodybuilders who wouldn't be using anything in the off season, typically perhaps, once they go on, they can do that, right? Sure. Because they got the gear, and then like they're going to
doing pump workouts and getting bigger.
They're getting bigger, so it's working for them, right? I mean, would they have looked better? Who knows, right? Yeah. Had they kept with the big compound exercises, the ones that they actually probably gained some size with in the off season, because those guys were much more conservative with what they did, right? Yeah. So that's, I think, somewhere where that comes from. Sorry, go ahead.
Another aspect I remember Kuba saying was that he would go to more machines in the diet phase because that way he wouldn't have to say support and get a dumbbell press into place, and work on stabilizing that. He could just simply work on pushing as absolute much weight as he could.
Right.
The machine itself is going to do the stabilizing for him.
Yeah. You need to do it like Dennis James did in his videos when he was in Thailand. You get a plate boy. Right? You have someone you hire on to move all your plates around, because there's something to say for that, right? I mean, that makes sense. But I think I would add, and I don't think Kuba would argue against this, is that I'm sure he kept some of those big lifts in there. Right?
Oh, yeah. And all of it's still really heavy.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? It's not like he was doing pump workouts.
Yeah, sure. So, that's part of this fatigue that is accrued, is like, do you go to a hack squat, or do you stick with the squat? And, if the hack, let's say you're doing both in your off season, and you use the hack squat as your measure of whether you've maintained function, that's okay. That makes sense. Drop the squat because it wrecks your back or whatever. But it's dance with the ones who brung you, so to speak. Some of them that are the big ones that really are the best tests of your overall strength. So, I think we knocked that one out of the park.
All right, great. Well, listen, we are also out of time. I know you've got stuff to do. Yeah, well, you got to roll, man. Okay. I think this is Natalia with us here. Yep, it sure is. I couldn't see her full name. Hey, Natalia, thanks for joining us.
Hey.
We got Miss Olympia here on the show. And, of course, guys, go to byobbcoach.com. You can get Scott's book there. I'll have a link for the hardcover autographed by Scott. He's got those up on eBay right now. You get the best price, plus some of that money goes to the ASPCA to help support animals. Of course, truenutrition.com. Use our code THINK over there to get some additional savings on all the supplements that Dante and his partner put out. They have great stuff, and they've been doing it for a long time. Their goal is to be able to put out high quality products for bodybuilders at the best prices that they can. So definitely a great place to go for anybody who's hardcore looking to grow as much muscle as possible. Use our code THINK. Of course, supplementsource.ca for Canadians. And they've got great deals week to week. Plus, guys, Patreon. Thank you to everybody from Patreon. You guys really are helping to make this thing happen. So thank you very much. And Scott, for another episode of Muscle Minds,
thanks, sir.
I'll bid you adieu. Thanks for joining us, man.
Bid you adieu as well.